Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. A big warm welcome to the fourth session in the 2021 IFAR virtual conference. My name's Francesca Cumani. You might know me from ITV racing in the UK or Channel 10's coverage of the Melbourne Cup, or you might know me as the keeper of the globetrotting star Purple Moon and subsequent star of the ROR show ring, and I suppose Instagram star if you follow me, with all of its various incarnations as basically pet, retrained racehorse, social media, prop and the above. I'm actually really honoured, really thrilled to have been asked to moderate one of these sessions, because the care of horses, the care of racehorses in particular, is something so important to me, both during their career and afterwards. These sessions have been brilliant at highlighting what has been happening in this sphere to best help the thoroughbreds in their career after racing. And if you haven't seen the first three sessions, I would strongly encourage you to do so, because it has discussed firstly the importance of thoroughbred aftercare, and then shown the various ways of implementing it best in all the different countries around the world. As we know, the UK, the US and Australia were really at the forefront of it, but over the last 5 years, with the help of IFAR, we have seen such a growth in this sphere to see so many different countries adopting all the different ideas for helping the thoroughbred have the best possible care and the best chances of different careers after they've finished racing. Actually, that video there that you saw is brilliant, seeing all the different ways that thoroughbreds can be used after they finish their career as a racehorse. Now, today's session is entitled Aftercare for Racing Participants. And just to give you a bit of a broad outline of what we'll be doing, we're going to be hearing from 4 experts in their field. Each person's going to make a presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end of that for about 20 minutes or so. So please do submit any questions you might have for anyone on the panel, and we will do our best to get them answered after the presentations. And then at the end of that, we're going to be hearing from Chair of the IFAR Steering Group and Chief Executive of the Retraining of Racehorses, Dayal Bathnot, to round off the last of the 4 sessions. So let me introduce you to the panelists for today. We have got Tom Reilly, I wasn't saying in Sydney, but I think in Canberra in a hotel room. So thanks for joining us, Tom. He is the Chief Executive of the Thoroughbred Breeders Australia and Aushorse. We've got Dr. Mark Fisher in New Zealand, scientist and author of the Animal Welfare Science, Husbandry and Ethics, the Evolving Story of Our Relationship with Farm Animals. We've got veterinarian Dr. Chris Riggs in Hong Kong, who's the director of the Equine Welfare Research Foundation and chief advisor of Veterinary Science at the club. And we've got Dr. Eliot Forbes in Brisbane from the IFAR Steering Committee. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I know we've got various different time zones going on, especially for you, Mark, in New Zealand. So thank you for giving up your time and being here with us. So I think we should get started. Up first today is Tom Reilly, who's speaking to us about the Thoroughbred Aftercare Welfare Working Group. Tom, I'm really keen to hear from you, because although Australia has done great things in this sphere of aftercare for thoroughbreds, I feel like there's a great deal of scrutiny from the public there. So please let us know how you're getting on.
Yeah, look, I think you're right in terms of in Australia. So my background before doing this current job, I was a journalist. So I was an editor of a newspaper in Sydney, and something that's really been very apparent in the last really 10, but especially 5 years is that level of scrutiny that we all face in the industry, and in Australia particularly. That is particularly, we've had a number of stories, not just to do with racing, but to do with animal welfare. And I'll talk about some of those actually in the presentation.
Okay, well, we can't wait to get you underway with your presentation, so kick on.
Right. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much, first of all, to everyone at IFAR for the opportunity to talk, but also for what I think has been a wonderful series that I think, you know, everyone who is passionate about racing and welfare will have enjoyed. I'm going to talk to you, as Cheska said, a bit about a program that we have, initiative that was really set up by TBA, but also supported by a lot of other stakeholders within the industry. And also just talk to you a bit about a few examples of the sort of pressure that the industry has been put under and other animal industries. I'll give you a quick snapshot first. I appreciate most people watching this are sort of familiar with racing, but just a bit about the Australian industry, because it's really worth bearing in mind, I think. Essentially, Australia has a huge thoroughbred industry. Our foal crop of about 13,500 is the second biggest in the world. Across the country, there are 3,000 race meetings a year. That's almost 19,000 races. And probably something certainly other countries, other racing jurisdictions I know look very jealously at, is the fact that 1 in every 244 Australians owns a share in a racehorse. So, you know, I've worked in the racing industry in America and I've worked in the UK. And I really don't think there's another country in the world that sort of embraces racing quite to the extent that Australia does. I think, you know, those stats, so the racing industry is worth about $9 billion to the Australian economy every year, and it actually employs almost 80,000 people have a full-time job on the back of the racing industry. So all of those, I think, point to an industry that's respected in many ways. It's part of the sort of fabric of society, if you will. But despite that, I think there are some signs that show that things are changing and that you know, the industry has to move with those, has to be proactive rather than reactive. And so one of those is just a shift in terms of population. So we're now in Australia, 86% of the population live in a major city or major town. So we've got one of the most urbanized populations of any major racing nation. And of course, that means that fewer and fewer people have a link to how animals are brought up or have a link to that sort of regional background. And that urbanization has also played a part in terms of the political situation within the country. So in Victoria, obviously the home of so I should say, Victoria is the state which Melbourne is the capital city. So the Melbourne Cup is obviously one of the biggest celebrations in Melbourne in the course of the year. The state parliament there has a representative from the Animal Justice Party. So as the name suggests, you've got someone in the upper house, in the state parliament, who their sole aim is to put animal welfare concerns onto the political agenda and to drive change as much as they can. I should say they also have representatives in the New South Wales. So New South Wales is a state that Sydney's the capital of. So they've got representatives in both of the two most populous states within Australia. On top of that, the Australian Greens Party, at the last general election, they received more than 1.5 million votes. So they are very often critical of racing, and so we've got a situation whereby racing is well accepted within society, but there is a small subset, or there is a subset of society, and that actually have a foothold within the parliament that are really quite opposed to the industry. As you'd expect when you hear those sort of the fact that so many people vote for the Greens or for the Animal Justice Party, it's no surprising that in Australia, the animal welfare lobby has proved incredibly effective. So I'm going to give you two quick examples around that. The first one is back in 2011. The national broadcaster, the ABC, aired footage of some cattle being really horribly mistreated and killed in Indonesia. The outrage that footage sparked meant that within 8 days, the Australian federal government banned the live export of cattle to Indonesia. And this is an industry that's worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. It's vital to many agricultural businesses in the north of Australia. And so within 8 days, as the outrage grew, the government stepped in and shut down an industry. The second example of that, I should say, it took, eventually it was reinstated, and it took, I think it took 4 years before that industry got back to the previous level. I should say the next example is around greyhounds, which some of you may have heard of. Again, it was the national broadcast of the ABC, presented a show on what's called live baiting. So greyhounds were actually fed other small animals to encourage them to chase the lure. So really shocking, horrific footage. And the government in New South Wales, as you would expect, called an inquiry. That took 4 months. The inquiry came back and the government looked to shut down the industry. So that a Conservative government would shut down an industry that employs 10,000 people, I think is really a good illustration of how, when a story captures the public's imagination, causes outrage, how quickly things can slide, how quickly governments will react, and you know, sensible reform, nuanced reform, measured responses probably go out the window, and it's really you know, things can move very fast. So I'll show you now a video of a story that happened at the end of 2019, just on the eve of the Spring Racing Carnival, so the biggest racing carnival, one of the biggest racing carnivals in the world.
Out, and we're seeing a second horse here who's been pulled out by the neck. There he is. And for the horses inside, it's even more horrific.
The images you're about to see are confronting. Covert cameras record horses being beaten and abused, others stomped and kicked.
Clearly, there's no excuse for that sort of treatment. That's not acceptable, of course it isn't. It's disgusting.
But I think, as those images show, they were truly horrific, and I don't think anyone could watch them and not really feel horrified at the treatment of those horses as they were taken to an abattoir in Queensland. As you could expect, that show caused a huge amount of outrage. It was timed, it went to air just 2 days before the Caulfield Cup, which is one of the biggest races, historically one of the biggest races in Australia, and that same weekend, the Everest, which is now one of the biggest races, certainly in Sydney, a $15 million race in Sydney, 2 days before the Everest. And as a journalist, I can tell you that timing was incredibly deliberate. The juxtaposition of, here is an industry that on the one hand is awash with money, likes nothing better than showing off everyone in their best clothes, their fancy clothes, having a wonderful time at the races, while at the same time can treat animals with the callous disregard that you saw those horses treated with. Of course, no one in that footage was from the racing industry. No one in the program was from the racing industry who was mistreating those animals. But of course, it's not a critique of the abattoirs or knackeries in Australia. That show was a critique of the racing industry. And I would say, wherever you are in the world, there will be journalists working on stories around the racing industry right now to do with poor animal welfare. Obviously, in Europe recently, we've had the case with Gordon Elliot, which sparked a huge amount of outrage. But we're a very high-profile industry. We race for a lot of money. Many of the people who are participants as owners are very high-profile of themselves. So, we can certainly expect more of that. When that show aired, I certainly felt, and most people within the industry felt, that we needed a response, and that we needed to really be seen. Well, firstly, we needed to actually take action to make sure that our horses were protected. Secondly, it was important that we were seen to be doing so and to be sincere in our efforts. So the TBA that I run essentially got together with a group of other participants in the industry and set up essentially an independent inquiry. Our view was that racing regulators have done a very good job in many situations, but that the seriousness of the allegations that we saw in that show really needed a response where we weren't marking our own scorecard, that we were happy to bring people in with suitable expertise to come and help us out, essentially. And for those, sorry, this slide we got up here, for those who don't think that even our core audience, our rusted on audience, don't think welfare is an issue, this is some polling conducted by the biggest bookmaker in Australia of actually their regular customers. So not people who bet infrequently, but regular customers. 70% of those people were aware of that show, of claims of mistreatment of animals, and 44%, so almost half of them, were less likely to bet on horse racing as a result of that. And certainly in England, you know, in Australia, the income from wagering is what has funded our industry and created our industry to the size and scope it is. So when you have rusted on punters telling you that, I think you've really got to sit up and take notice. So we got together with a range of other groups, and you'll see there on that slide, essentially some of the biggest names in horse racing and the breeding industry right the way across Australia to set up this inquiry. So I reached out and we set up this group, and it's headed by the former Premier of Victoria, Dr. Dennis Napthine. So Dennis is a veterinarian who then went into politics, and he ended up running the state of Victoria, and he was also served as the racing minister. So someone who has, I actually think he's watching this evening, so someone who has great recognition across society. He's a respected figure, but he also has that real knowledge of the industry, which I think was so important. Also on the panel of the RSPCA Australia, an eminent vet and a policy expert who has worked as the special advisor to agriculture for 3 different prime ministers in Australia. So we were able to get together a really credible group and encourage them to interact both with the industry, but also with people outside of racing and breeding, and often actually with many of the critics. This approach immediately was welcomed by government. The fact that an industry was getting, not waiting to be regulated, not even waiting for its own internal industry regulators to do the job, but actually get on the front foot, and the participants were driving it, was something that I think has been well received, certainly both by politicians and just by the community more generally. So I should say that so far the panel have received 180 submissions. So when we started this process, I really had no idea how many people would come on board, and the fact that 180 individual submissions have been made just shows how engaged people are. Many of the leading people across the industry have made submissions, and all of those have been read by the panel. I should say all the regulatory bodies in racing have also made submissions, and the group have met with 60 different individuals or groups in face-to-face consultation as they pull together their report. So hopefully in the next month or so, they'll be releasing their report, which will have recommendations on ways to improve the industry. So in actual fact, the reason I'm in Canberra today is because we've got 3 days of meetings. So we finished day 1 today. So as the panel look to finish their work. So I hope that gives you a bit of an introduction into the work they're doing. I'd like to share a bit more about what their recommendations will be, but I'm sort of sworn to secrecy at this stage.
Thank you very much, Tom. We look forward to hearing what their findings are, what their recommendations are. That video came out in 2019, and like you say, right on the eve of the Spring Carnival for maximum impact. You kind of wonder what the agenda is there, don't you? I could have lots of questions for you, but the questions are to be submitted by people watching, not me, because that would make the session rather long. So thank you, Tom, and we will move on. Dr. Mark Fisher, I know it is late for you in New Zealand, so apologies for that. Thank you for being with us again. Dr. Fisher has an extensive background in animal welfare regulation, livestock production, animal ethics, and philosophy. And the title of today's address is Alas, Poor Shergar. I am intrigued. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and good morning, everybody. What I want to do this morning is reflect on the importance of values and community expectations in the way that horses are treated. Now, we all know the welfare of a horse depends on the strappers, jockeys, trainers, owners, and a myriad of others like truck drivers, as you mentioned, Tom. But increasingly, the treatment of animals has been directed from beyond the stable, beyond the track or the bird cage, and beyond the abattoir, beyond the trucks or drivers that take the horses there. And that's what I'd like to reflect on a little bit. So I'll start. There we go. Oh, yeah. I'll start with 3 horses just to get you into the picture. And I want you, as we go through them, I want you to think about what sort of life they've had. Has it been a good life? How do we know that they've had a good life? And importantly, how do we portray those lives? And most importantly, what are other people likely to think about these 3 horses? And the next slide is our first horse, Shergar. Shergar was Irish bred and British trained, as I'm sure all of you are aware. His 8 starts brought 6 wins, a 2nd place and a 4th. And his penalty for coming 4th was to be retired to stud. And some of those races were pretty big. The Epsom Derby was one of them. So Shergar was a real celebrity. Everybody knew about him. He was the successful face of racing. However, he was kidnapped, held to ransom, and killed. But those were the circumstances of his death. And that death aside, I think he had a pretty good life. And perhaps most of you would do, especially those who would like to have owned him. Now, the second horse is Willie. Not many of you will know Willie. He was a New Zealand bred, but he never raced. He was too slow to make it to the racetrack. Willie became a farm horse on a sheep and beef cattle property in the days before horses were replaced by motorbikes on farms. Willie was still a racehorse though. He had to be first up the track when you were riding him. He had to be first through the gate. After Willie retired, he died of old age. This is the largely unknown face of racing. The ones that don't make it to the races and the ones who have a really good afterlife, in my opinion, again. And the third slide, or the third horse, is Pride of Westbury. Again, New Zealand bred and raced in Australia. His 4 wins and 5 places came from 38 starts, a few more than Shergar. Unfortunately, Pride of Westbury fell and was put down. And this evocative image is now used by a group advocating for the better care of racehorses, including banning their jumps. To some, this is perhaps the ugly side of the race, the death of animals. In the next slide, these images demonstrate the good life, but people see that good life differently. And I think it highlights the complex relationship with animals. As one author entitled his book, "Some we love, some we hate, some we eat." It is evident in the next slide how we understand animal welfare. It is complex. And as we go down these bullet points, it's what the animal experiences. That's the one that most people in animal welfare science are concerned with. Animal welfare is what the animal experiences, whether it's fearful, whether it's happy, whether it's hungry, etc. And the next one is how it performs. Typically in farming, we talk about live weight gain and milk production, that sort of thing. How it performs is probably closer to the racing industry. And the next one is getting a little bit harder, how it lives in keeping with its nature. And this is the idea that birds have got to fly, swim, fish have got to swim. And if we don't enable them to do so or allow them to do so, they suffer. This is the idea that people have, that an animal's welfare is best if it's living in a natural environment and is able to behave naturally. And the fourth one is even more difficult for regulators particularly, and that is if your animal is treated with dignity and respect. And those last two, living with its nature and dignity and respect, are pretty hard to understand, but they're probably the ones that most of the public identify with. So we have to keep those at the forefront of what we're doing and what we're saying. Of course, all that is well, but it's made even more complicated by the next bullet point, the compromises necessary and reasonable for the good of the animal. So we might geld a racehorse to make it easier to behave, for instance. And the next bullet point also highlights the fact that it's complicated by animals' needs and our appreciation of what those needs are. And the last one is human needs, preferences, and prejudices. So we've got a very complex understanding of animal welfare. It's not simple. And that complexity is changing, superbly summed up in the next slide by Peter Curl from the Hong Kong Jockey Club. And in the first point, talk about a horse's quality of life. Its welfare, safety, and durability are critical to the popularity and sustainability of the racing industry. And Peter goes on in the next point to talk about increasing scrutiny and opposition to racing industry, as Tom highlighted. And the third one, that we are in the midst of a revolution in how animals are viewed and treated, especially in sport, wagering, or entertainment. That revolution is evident in the increasing pressure in the next slide on the greyhound industry. Rodeos, particularly in New Zealand, are coming under a lot of pressure. And from these two pictures of animals in zoos and animals in circuses, that has changed remarkably in the last 10 or 20 years particularly. So how do we react? A common response is typically one of these sorts of things. Horses love to race, are born to have a rider on their back. We live and breathe the welfare of our horses, and love of the horse is the driving force. Now, these sorts of arguments may be true, but do they do justice to our understanding of animal welfare? To the ways that people value horses? I don't think they do. And in the next slide, I'd just like to introduce 2 of the 10 ways that David Daly, a rancher in the States and a teacher at university, has listed 10 ways to lose the animal arguments. Number 8 is being reactive rather than ahead of the issues. I think you're probably ahead of the issues when it comes to aftercare, but a reactive one example is probably the use of the whip. And the number 10 was not building coalitions that include consumers and the public. So how do we make use or make sense of all of this complexity? A good start for me is to begin with the common view reflecting a long history of thought about animals that goes back at least 2,000 years. And that is that the use of animals is acceptable as long as it is humane. However, some harms are prohibited. We can't blow marijuana into the nostril of a racehorse before the race to get a good finish. Some harms are justified if the benefits outweigh those harms. And I mentioned gelding the horse. We think that the behaviour of the horse after it's been gelded is better for us and perhaps for the horse. And the last one is that any harm should be minimised as far as reasonably possible. And for that, we demand that the animal is given anaesthesia and pain relief, for instance. Now, it sort of follows if you do this, the animals have a good life. So a good life and a quick death. But we've got a problem here. This wastage, as animal advocates will tell you, there's routine killings of ex-racehorses are happening every day. Or we can have a good life after racing. And there are many examples of good life, as we've heard, we've seen, in this case, equestrian, endurance, companionship, show jumping, polo, and therapy. If these sorts of alternatives are and can be used, how should we show the world that they are being used? And that's what I'd like to go on and talk about now. And we can learn from the experiences of the use of animals in research, testing, and teaching, arguably the most controversial use of animals that society faces. The method that people in research, testing, and teaching are using now is to get your house in order and show it. What sort of life do your animals have? How do we know? Can we trust you? And the next one highlights the approach that I like to use of identifying the issues, providing information, and involving people. People don't like surprises, as we're all aware. And perhaps the media goes or works on showing those surprises. So to overcome that, perhaps we would be better to show normal practices, show how things work, show the improvements and efforts to change practices that you are all going through all the time. If you don't, myths, truths, bad practices, images without context will continue to fill the vacuum. And remember that perceptions matter. Whether those perceptions are right or wrong, good or bad, whether they're your opponents or, as in the next slide, your supporters. And just remember the great unwashed members of the public between your opponents and your supporters. They're the ones who will probably drive change when they find out about things. So the next slide is try and tell us that your horses are retrained and rehomed. Tell us of the problems you face and of the thrill your horses get. I know there's loads of people that love horses, that love the little bits and pieces that horses do with them. And those are the things that tell really good stories. I'd just like to finish with Ulrich Ralph's book, Farewell to the Horse. In it, he talks about the Centaurian Pact, that we have matched or gathered together the power and speed of the horse and the wisdom and cunning of humans. Now, we've done that over the last 6,000 years, particularly in our military, transport, and farming activities. But the last century or so, we've walked away from the horse, walked away from that pact, and the horse has been reduced to a part-time role, according to Ulrich, in recreation, therapy, status, and my favourite, pastoral support for female puberty. Now, part of that revolution that Peter Curl talked about, shaping the future, may be to start drawing on the pact that we had with the horse, that Centaurian Pact. Horses are a very, very significant part of human culture, and we still have to retain some of that. A good life after racing is surely the wise, if not the cunning thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mark Fisher. That was really fascinating. I love the story about the 3 different horses at the start. And like you say, for all of Shergar's high profile, renowned, the racehorse that ended up on the cattle farm, you don't hear about. And I suppose Tom would know in particular, it's a media thing, isn't it? The media like a bad story. The Gordon Elliott story gets headlines all around the world, but you don't hear the positive news stories a lot of the time about people and their horses having a great time. I feel like this could prompt a lot of questions. So please do submit your questions. We'll do our best to answer them after our presentations. Up next, we have got another veterinary expert, Dr. Chris Riggs, is talking to us from Hong Kong. He's got an extensive bio, which I read through, but the bit that really stood out was the 75 papers he's written about the fatigue of bone and its role in racehorse fractures. I think that's a fascinating topic. Today, he is presenting to us on the subject of the dangers of one last start.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Francesca, and thank you very much to IFAR for the invitation to speak today. It's my great pleasure to join this forum and join these distinguished other speakers. I'm going to give a slightly more technical talk, and the title that I was asked to focus on was The Danger of That One Last Start. And what that really focuses on is that clearly what we all want is to have a horse that's fit and healthy in its racing career, that hopefully gets some enjoyment out of that career itself, and obviously everyone who's involved with it gets enjoyment. But then what's really important, we want that horse to be fit and healthy when it retires, to go and have a good life in retirement, and any one of those many different activities that they can be engaged with that we've seen illustrated already. And there are indeed many activities that they can become engaged in, but they need to be in a fit state to do that. And it's very important that we look after them when they are racing, to get them in that peak position. Now, we're all familiar with the scene, and it's all very understandable. We've got a mare who's just about to retire, and everyone's keen just to get one more run out of her or keep him going to the end of the season. All these scenarios, I think, are all very well intentioned and very well to understand them. But the really important thing that I want to make is that in doing this, what people don't appreciate is they may very well be unwittingly subjecting their horse to greater risk of potentially severe injury, or what's more likelier, some most likely orthopedic condition that will result in some long-term disablement in retirement. So the horse will not be so fit to become engaged in other activities. And the other important thing is if he can't engage in those activities, it's not so valuable, not necessarily in the monetary sense, but in the sense that it's going to make a useful contribution, so people really do want to look after it. So these are very important issues. So the big question, of course, is why? What's going on with just squeezing in that one last start? And that's what I'm going to illustrate, some of the scientific aspects of what we know about that will increase the risk of an injury or a problem. So my first point is, we now know from work done over the last 30 years that nearly all of the orthopedic injuries, and the orthopedic injuries are by far and away the most common cause of problems for horses not being fit in retirement, if you like. Nearly all of these orthopedic conditions are progressive in nature. So they don't just suddenly happen, they slowly get worse and worse and worse. And there is a danger that they have a tipping point, and if you keep pushing that horse trying to get that one last start out of it, there is an increased danger of reaching that tipping point. And then the other thing that I want to illustrate as well is that changing the training schedule for a horse can result in problems that many people wouldn't really be aware of. And I want to try and illustrate that. There are altered bone repair mechanisms that can have significant impact. Change in fitness of the horse will have a profound impact on the loads on the skeleton. And also, it's very easy to become a little bit reliant on medications, which in their own right may be very good, but they might disguise issues that would otherwise cause warning signs. So I want to look at those in a little bit more detail now. And the first one is to pushing the horse when we're close to the tipping point. What do I mean by that? Well, most of these orthopedic injuries, I've already said that they're progressive in nature. Another good way of saying that is they're repetitive stress injuries. And there are a lot of those in life, a lot of those in humans. One of my favorites that I found once is a condition called ice cream scooper's hand. In other words, if you keep repeatedly doing the same activity, then there is a danger that you will cause some fatigue to the bone or other tissues, which can lead to a more significant injury. So let's take the example of bone. Here's the fetlock joint, an extra of the fetlock joint on the horse, bottom left, so we can see the cannon bone at the top and the long pastern down the bottom, the two sesamoid bones. And you can imagine that being loaded, and it's really just the same. This horse, daily going, doing its fast exercise, racing every so often, you imagine it's really not far different to a piece of metal, in this case, a paperclip, being bent backwards and forwards. And every time it does some work, it's bending that paperclip a little bit more. And as we know, you can bend it once or twice and it's no problem at all. But as you bend it more and more times, then it'll start to get a bit weaker. And we can demonstrate that with simple mechanics, and we look at the deformation or strain and how that changes with the load or load per unit area of stress. And we can see that as this paperclip, as it's bent backwards and forwards, it starts to get weaker and weaker. And then suddenly we might start to see little cracks forming in the bone. Or I'm illustrating it on the right-hand side of the slide, an engineering component made of metal, and you can see a classic fatigue crack in that component. If you look very closely, you can see there's an arrow, and that arrow is pointing to a little crack in the bone. And over the last 10, 15 years or so, we've come to really appreciate and get very much better at using simple X-ray technology to start to see these very little cracks that would have been overlooked in the past. Now, if you go on loading the bone with these little cracks there, then the stress at that one point. At the point of that crack, it's going to get greater and greater. And then there is a real danger. It will go on and fracture in a very serious way. And indeed, this bone here was this same bone a little further down on the line. It was only when I went back and looked at this, and this was some time ago before we really started appreciating these things, that we realized it really does lead to a problem. Okay, so that's repetitive stress injuries. The other things I mentioned are these other interesting physiological issues, such as changes in the bone repair mechanism, effective fitness, etc. Let's just look at those. So bone is an absolutely brilliant tissue. If you're an engineer and you had bone to work with, you would just be as happy as Larry, because it adapts to the loads they're putting on it. So the bone gets bigger over time as the loads increase, gets smaller if you get sent into space and the loads get down, but also it's able to heal itself. However, there's a paradox to that. Bone is a hard tissue, and I've tried to just illustrate it diagrammatically here. We're looking at a horse's humerus, so just below its shoulder, and there's a diagrammatic cross-section through the bone. You can see it's got an outer shell, the cortex, with a red medulla on the inside, and all these little blood vessels in it. It's packed full of living cells. Now, if you get a little bit of damage to that bone, and I've just illustrated here, then the only way that damage can be repaired is if it's first of all removed and then replaced with healthy tissue. And this is called the process of remodeling. So this is a microscopic enlargement of this, not to scale process of what's going on down here. And you have these big cells called osteoclasts that come along and they munch a tunnel out. So it's just like engineers cutting through rock to create a road tunnel. They're cutting a tunnel out and will eventually cut out and eat away that bit of dead bone. And then behind it come these other cells, engineering cells, if you like, who lay down healthy, fresh bone. And this tunnel is about 1/4 of a millimeter in diameter, typically. Now, over time, this tunnel eats away through, eats all the dead bone up, then it fills up with healthy new bone, and then, hey presto, you've got a nice healthy bone again. So if we look at it here, cross-section here, you have these tubular structures in bone, and here's a bit of damage. These osteoclasts come along, eat the bone away, create a big hole, which then fills up progressively with new bone, and there you are, it's restored to full health again. It's very, very smart. However, there is a period of time when you've got a big black hole there. So there's less bone there. There's a weakness in the bone, if you like. And the time taken for that hole to be filled in is about 3 months. It does vary, but roughly 3 months. Now, there's an even more clever mechanism behind all this, which is when the horse is in regular training and the bones are being loaded and bent regularly, then those cells that eat away the bone seem to be inhibited. So you've got a bit of crack, but bone can probably cope with that crack. It doesn't want holes in the bone. However, if the horse then rests for a period of time, those cells sense that and they're activated and they start doing their job of repairing the bone and eating holes out. Now you can imagine if there's an area of concentration of damage, maybe repetitive stress injury with lots of little cracks or something in the bone, then it might be that you get a concentration of those holes, and that creates a local porosity, which is a weakening of the bone. And that particularly happens where you have this period where if you have a period of rest where that may be activated. If the horse then starts racing again, so you squeeze in, you say, oh, well, we thought we'd finish, but let's just squeeze in one last start before the season's over. Then there's a danger that horse may be working when you've got all those holes there and it can fracture through there. This is a more common injury in younger horses, but we do see them in stress fractures in older horses. And indeed, here's a horse's humerus again, the typical stress fracture that formed that then turned into this catastrophic fracture. And if we take an X-ray at a microscopic level through the bone, here are all these holes with a big fracture line going through it. So if we leave an interval, if we put a big break in the horses, it doesn't even need to be big, 3 or 4 weeks or so in a horse's training regime, and then bring it back in to just squeeze in that last race or whatever. There is a danger, certainly in some cases, that you will be increasing the risk of this type of fracture occurring. The other 2 points I wanted to make. One was that physiological fatigue in itself can lead to increased risk of damage to the bones. So this kind of just means getting exhausted. Now, I mentioned already, when you put a load on a bone, like any engineering structure, it will deform, it will bend. You can measure the amount it bends by sticking a strain gauge on it and record the actual amount of bending. Now, quite a lot of work has been done in military recruits. It used to be that the horses were a good model for the military, and now the military is quite a good model for the horses. And quite a lot of work's actually gone on in Israel. And this particular study took a whole load of really elite athletes. They stuck these strain gauge, not athletes, I should say, sorry, elite soldiers, stuck these strain gauges onto their tibia, so their shin bone, sent them on a 50-mile, 60-mile forced hike. And at the start of the hike, the loads on the bones were around there, or the amount the bones bent was around here. Now, at the end of the hike, when these guys were exhausted, and there may have been some women in there too, then for exactly the same load, so they're carrying the same loads, going at exactly the same speed, the amount of bending of the bone was very much greater. Now, the reason for that is muscles are very important in controlling the direction of loads on the bones. And they fine-tune everything so that the load goes straight down the bone or straight down the way that the bone has developed to resist, adapted to resist. If the muscles get very fatigued, then the loads on the bones get altered in direction and their magnitude gets very much higher. It's exactly the same applying to a horse. Again, you're getting towards the end, this horse is exhausted, or maybe it's been out of work a while, well, let's just squeeze in this one last start, and it's not peak fitness, then there is a real danger that physiological fatigue will increase that risk. And then lastly, I think everyone who's in racehorse practice will be very familiar with this very, very good use of corticosteroids injected into a joint. It's just one example that will quell inflammation. And it's a very useful and very important treatment, and it can be very good medicine. However, there is a danger associated with it. It's also a very powerful painkiller. And the danger is that the horse can end up appearing more comfortable than it really ought to be for the state of its joints, or if there's some serious pathology that's going on in there, you don't notice it anymore. So really these drugs need to be used very judiciously. And certainly in a horse that's getting towards the end of its career, when they're used, they should be used in association with careful imaging of the joints, say with X-ray or whatever, just to check that there's nothing serious going on. So in summary, pushing a horse too far for too long will allow the microdamage in the bones to accumulate all these little cracks that result in these repetitive stress injuries that, if they just build up to a dangerous level, can then result in a little crack that then suddenly becomes a very big crack and a fracture. Squeezing a race into a horse that you thought you'd let down, but actually, no, let's just get another race into it, runs a risk on working the horse on bones that have been weakened by a natural physiological process. And then, of course, running a horse that isn't fit, again, if its muscles are not working as effective as they should do towards the end of the race, there is an increased risk of greater loads on the bone. And a horse that has been medicated may have worse injury in there than you really realize. You need to be sensitive to that. So the take-home message is we all should be aware of these things. In particular, owners should be aware of these factors when pushing their trainer, saying, come on, let's get another race out. Trainers should be aware of them. And of course, all veterinary surgeons should be aware of them, to work together as a team to try and prevent these things from happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chris Rigg. That was so interesting. And like you say, prevention is so important, isn't it? Both to stop them injuring themselves on the track, like we know how bad that looks as well, but also to be able to make sure that they're in the best possible condition for when they do go on and have a second career. I know with my own horse, Purple Moon, he could have continued racing, but the owners very much took the decision to stop and to make sure that he would have the best possible life afterwards. And age 18, he's still going strong. So that is so important. Right, we are going a little bit over time, but hopefully everyone's enjoying the session as much as I am, and we've got one speaker still to come, and then we are going to get stuck into the Q&A. Dr. Eliot Forbes has chaired Racing Australia's inaugural Racehorse Retirement Committee, and he put in place the world's first retirement notification framework. And today, on behalf of the IFAR Steering Committee, he's presenting to us the Aftercare Toolkit.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and it's a pleasure to be here, and we're so thrilled to have such a good audience from right around the world tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, IFAR has conducted a number of these forums around the world over the last few years, and we've been very fortunate to learn from some outstanding speakers. The IFAR Steering Committee has selected 6 practical strategies that any jurisdiction can put in place to either begin or enhance their aftercare journey. It's my pleasure, on behalf of this steering committee, to present a framework which we call the Aftercare Toolkit. The first strategy relates to life cycle management, and specifically the rules of racing and traceability. Racing's regulatory powers relate to the racing phase of a horse's life. Traceability systems from other animal industries are establishing new community expectations, however. Society expects the regulator to know who the licensed animals are and where they are throughout their life. Now, for racing, this has critical implications because we have no jurisdiction when horses leave the industry. So let's consider the early phases of a horse's life. Some countries like the UK and Australia have moved to extend their regulatory oversight back up the supply chain and have implemented traceability obligations on the breeding sector. In those countries, racing authorities must be notified of the birth and the identification and location of a foal within 30 days of birth. Foal movements must be registered with authorities, and breeding stock may be subject to out-of-competition drug testing at any time. Racing authorities around the world should investigate methods to either secure regulatory oversight or partner with their breed registries to help achieve traceability. The second aspect of traceability relates to the horse's post-racing career. Rules can be put in place to establish visibility regarding the horse's first exit from racing. Notification rules were first implemented in Australia in 2014 and have been adopted by several countries, including New Zealand and South Africa. Now, this rule places an obligation on the owner or their agent to notify the authorities of when a horse is retired. Information may also be requested, such as the reason for retirement and destination post-racing. We understand that Racing Australia receives approximately 7,000 notifications of retirement each year. Their 2020 data reveals that 60% of horses off the track continue their careers in the equestrian world, while another 19% go to the breeding industry. 10% are euthanized, 7% die of natural causes, 2% go to official retirement programs, and 2% have other exit destinations. Racing Australia publishes racehorse retirement every year in its annual report. Now, activists and the media attacked the Racing Australia framework in 2019, as Tom showed earlier in this presentation, and they made certain claims regarding the numbers of thoroughbreds going to abattoirs. Now, the Racing Australia data doesn't account for movements of horses or horse deaths after the first point of exit and doesn't claim to do so. It is data about the first exit destination of horses when they leave the track. Now, unfortunately, such nuances are easy to be glossed over in a media frenzy, but importantly, there is a framework in place, there is data being collected, and there is transparency as the statistics are published. Now, the more challenging question relates to traceability beyond the horse's first exit from the racing industry, and racing does not have regulatory power in the community. Legislation is the only way in which thoroughbred traceability can be comprehensively delivered beyond first exit. Yet no countries have a holistic equine traceability legislative framework. And key questions remain as to who is responsible for oversight of horses in the general community and who should operate and fund a traceability system. A national working group is currently considering these questions in the Australian context. But fortunately, putting in place rules of racing do not demand significant financial resources, and there are opportunities for every racing jurisdiction to emulate best practice. We call our second set of strategies transitioning strategies. The community expects that racing must invest in its horses beyond the track. Our traditional approach has been to allow the market dynamics of the equestrian world to dictate post-racing outcomes. As identified, Australia's data indicates that 60% of horses leaving the racetrack enter the equestrian industry in some capacity. So finding ways to improve the transition of off-the-track thoroughbreds to the equestrian industry is very important. So the strategies can be divided into those that increase the supply of horses to equestrian markets and those that stimulate demand from those markets. So when you begin to think about the strategies for your jurisdiction, consider if the program increases supply or increases demand. Supply side strategies increase the number of horses entering the equestrian market. And supply side strategies include where racing authorities directly fund the retraining of racehorses themselves or through third parties. They may provide subsidies to retrainers or own and operate facilities themselves. Another supply side approach relates to implementing quality assurance programs for retrainers and their facilities. And jurisdictions like Racing Victoria have approved retrainer programs. Racing authorities have no regulatory authority beyond the racing industry. However, voluntary participation in quality assurance schemes will support good welfare outcomes. One of the best examples of this is the US's Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance, or the TAA, and they administer a comprehensive national program of quality assurance linked to grant funding. Supply side strategies are most effective if there is a concurrent increase in demand. Demand side strategies create interest in off-the-track thoroughbreds. Sponsorship can be used to boost equestrian prize money for thoroughbred class events, with conditions requiring that the thoroughbred is an off-the-track thoroughbred. It then becomes lucrative for riders to compete on an off-the-track thoroughbred compared to other breeds. And equestrian riders will begin to actively seek out off-the-track thoroughbreds. And of course, it also supports the business model of existing retrainers. Sponsorship strategies are scalable, meaning that racing jurisdictions can initially launch with modest funding and there is no capital investment required. In the US, the Retired Racehorse Project is an excellent example where a marquee event can stimulate demand and raise the profile of the breed. Now, other initiatives can help stimulate demand include implementing supportive administrative processes that smooth the transition between racing and equestrian. If we can remove the friction, we can make it easy for people to transition horses from one administrative regime to another. The US Jockey Club has a program called the Thoroughbred Incentive Program, or TIP numbers, which provides off-the-track thoroughbreds with a unique identifier that allows a horse to compete in a wide range of sponsored equestrian disciplines. Now, the third area includes those areas which create a safety net for horses in need. As we can all appreciate, horses have different temperaments and different levels of athletic ability. Accordingly, our strategies need to address all of that diversity. Now, of course, elite horses will find homes easily, and the middle majority of horses will benefit from the supply and the demand strategies which I've just outlined. But it's the bottom tier, and they represent the horses who, for some reason or another, will not make it to the breeding shed or to an equestrian home. They might have injuries, they might have an unsuitable temperament, or they might not simply be athletic. Now, these horses need different strategies as they have the potential to become the horses at risk. Now, fortunately, there are low-cost administrative solutions that can form the foundation of a safety net. The US Trotting Association led the way in this space with a program called Full Circle. The program entails building database fields in the horse registry that permits an interested person nominating themselves to be contacted in the event that their nominated horse ever fell into an at-risk situation. There's no cost to participate and no enduring obligation for the nominee to provide support. They simply have the option to provide support if they choose. The horse registry accepts the responsibility to coordinate and share the details of the respective parties if required. And this approach has the benefit of extending industry support beyond that first exit point from industry. There's a few other safety net approaches as well, and the others are more interventionist and they require more resources. So that might include providing funding or sponsorship to various horse rescues or charities. Racing authorities may choose to be more hands-on and consider having a dedicated crisis response funding or even purchase or lease rescue facilities. Very clearly, different models will suit different operating environments. We call our fourth set of strategies equine therapy and community engagement. There are tremendous opportunities for racing to link to charities that utilise horses, including off-the-track thoroughbreds, for therapeutic or rehabilitation programs. There are many successful programs that support war veterans, people with disadvantages or disabilities or disadvantaged kids. And some programs are integrated into correctional facilities to assist with inmate rehabilitation. The Man of War project in the US is a groundbreaking research study that seeks to determine the effectiveness of equine therapy to treat veterans who suffer from PTSD. Now, these programs represent excellent opportunities for racing to link with meaningful social causes. Racing needs to promote and, if necessary, support or fund the use of off-the-track thoroughbreds as part of these programs. Racing has an important role to promote the thoroughbred to the equestrian market, and we call the fifth item in the toolkit thoroughbred advocacy. At the 2017 IFAR Forum, US Olympian Boyd Martin advised us that over the years, the equestrian market in the US had trended towards the use of warm bloods and other sport horse breeds. Accordingly, the demand for off-the-track thoroughbreds declined, which put pressure on the business model of retrainers working with thoroughbreds. They had less demand for thoroughbreds, and there were fewer opportunities for racing to pass through their horses to those retrainers. We need to celebrate the success of our off-the-track heroes and ensure that the popularity of the thoroughbred as a versatile equestrian athlete is not allowed to decline. We also need to advocate for the aftercare work that we do and communicate that to the community. Racing authorities need to dedicate resources to building a narrative around the aftercare strategies that jurisdiction has in place. Racing, in fact, needs to be the strongest advocate for the thoroughbred breed and for the work that the industry does. The final strategy is to engage in networking. Now, IFAR is fully appreciative that there is a tremendous diversity in the nature of racing industries around the world. There's diversity in community expectations and diversity in approaches to aftercare. Your country may not yet have aftercare on your agenda, or you may not think that you need to fund aftercare initiatives. But from IFAR's perspective, we believe that you need to make a start. Society is changing and racing must evolve. Racing authorities shouldn't need an excuse to reach out and engage with the equestrian federation in their country. Are there administration arrangements that could be discussed that could help smooth that ownership transition from racing to equestrian? Are there sponsorship opportunities? Are there charities operating in your jurisdiction? Can you initiate or support an aftercare social media network in your country? Is there a person in your jurisdiction whose job it is to work on aftercare? IFAR's Aftercare Toolkit has been developed following several years of reviewing best practice from around the world. This slide demonstrates that the toolkit strategies can touch every point in a horse's life. The strategies are practical and cost-effective and are available for any racing jurisdiction to put in place. And so in closing, I would like to stress the importance for all racing nations to make a start. Racing faces a level of scrutiny and activist challenge that it has never encountered before. Community expectations are evolving and racing needs to adapt and put in place new strategies in order to survive. a caring industry will be a sustainable industry. At IFAR, our mission is to promote the care of thoroughbred horses during their lifetime. We want to see aftercare structurally embedded in the racing business model of every country and in the heart of every racing participant. At IFAR, we're available to provide advice to racing jurisdictions and work with you regarding which strategies will work best in your country. Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you, Eliot. I have unmuted myself, haven't I? Yes. Thank you, Eliot, and thank you to all of you for the presentations. Interesting, yeah, hearing from you there, Eliot, about the different ways people put structures in place to rehome their racehorses. And it was actually interesting going back to something Di Arbuthnot said in the first session about how recently, with the restrictions from COVID-19, the demand for horses, generally racehorses off the track, has gone up. So there's clearly the market forces, supply and demand, that is influential, but also the positivity, the positive messaging about how adaptable racehorses are, and celebrating their achievements off the track as well is so important. Right, let's get stuck into our Q&A. Tom, the first question to you is a question from Alexa. How are you honestly able to convey to the public that some horses do end up at abattoirs while saying that your industry cares about aftercare?
What a great question. Look, I think that's a really, it's a really good question. Firstly, I would say that obviously I showed some footage there of horses going to an abattoir. We will never, and we should never defend the sort of images we saw in that clip. So first of all, we have to make sure that the treatment of horses is always they're treated with dignity and treated humanely, whatever the length of their life and up to the very point of death. So first of all, I think that's got to be a sort of prerequisite in any of that conversation. But of course, there will be times when euthanasia or even the humane processing of the horse is a really appropriate decision to make, and that's a tough thing to really explain to people in the community. And look, from the process we've been in, many of the groups who are, all of the welfare groups acknowledge that there is an appropriate time for a horse, for an end of life, and that often, not taking that decision early enough can end up in a worse situation. But how do we deal with it in terms of the public? Well, first of all, I think we've got to actually have we've got to engage with people in a really honest fashion and actually be clear with them and not try and spin it. But that means we've got to have data available to say that, look, this isn't the outcome that happens to most horses or every horse. This is a small subset of the population that for behavioural or because of injury, etc. This might be, their end of life might be an appropriate way, but it's by no means every horse. And actually, I know from the work that the group under Dennis Knapfine are carrying out, part of the research that's gone into some of their recommendations and just supporting their project is around community perception, and they'll use that information in their report. But I think I think I'm fine to share with you. I sat in a lot of focus groups, and there is a huge amount of people who think that when a horse's racing career is over, its life will shortly be over thereafter, or a horse that's bred by the breeding industry that doesn't race, well, necessarily that horse is dead. So actually that wild misconception of our industry is an opportunity, because actually the story we've got to tell, if we have the data to tell that story and we've got the conviction to explain to people, we actually have a good story to tell. And certainly from the research that we've done, the perception of our industry is worse than the reality. So if we can harness that information and actually speak to people in a really honest and authentic voice, then I think that they will be accepting of the fact that some horses actually, they're not going to live in a paddock till they're, till they die of old age. And in fact, keeping your horse beyond its without purpose in a paddock might actually be a poor welfare outcome. Sorry, that was a slightly long answer there, but
that's a good answer. But it's so interesting, isn't it? Because you look at that ABC report, and they've very much taken the abattoir situation and linked it to the racing industry. Whereas this touches a bit on what you were talking about, Eliot, is the traceability, in the sense that some of those horses might have been quite well advanced in years, and they would have gone from a breeder to a trainer to rehoming to somewhere else, and then ended up there. So I suppose it's a bigger question, isn't it? Responsibility. Like, whose responsibility is the end of life for these horses? Is it the breeder? Is it the trainer? Is it the owner? Whose shoulders does it rest on?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Francesca. And I think there's a couple of things to always keep in mind, of course, is that every country will have some sort of legislation in place to ensure that the euthanasia is carried out whenever that is carried out, is done so in a humane and appropriate manner. So then the question is, as a horse then progresses through, it could be quite a few number of owners and different phases of their career. How do we put obligations on those people who are just general people in the community in relation to tracking that horse? Traceability is a complex topic, and it not only relates to the identification of the horse, but you've got to have a registered location where they are. And then you need a commitment from the people involved who handle the horse that they're going to collect data of in and out from their own facility, and then upload that to some sort of central database where that can be strung together from end to end. The commercial drivers in the livestock industry are obviously very clear in terms of human health, safety, and food safety, and biosecurity. They're not necessarily the same drivers we have in the equestrian side. So, they're the sort of difficult challenges that we have going forward. But, as society moves forward, the expectation is changing. And, that's the challenge in front of us, to work out how we're going to start to bring this together.
100%. Next question is for Mark. In his view, how has the racing industry's response to animal welfare concerns compared to other industries? And what can we learn from other industries?
This is another really hard question. I'm not sure that there is any one industry that stands out more than any of the others. Within New Zealand, I think the dairy industry is doing a great job at farmer level to work with farmers and get changes. And they're really doing it from a behavioural change, what makes the person tick type of approach. But I still think we've got a long way to go. But in dairy recently, we've been defending practices which cannot be defended, to be quite honest. So perhaps the one industry that I've been involved with, if you call it an industry, it's only a very small one, but it's the poultry fancy. These are the people who breed game birds for show. And they're the ones that I think have been very, very open, in my opinion, and have willingly welcomed ideas of how to improve things for their birds. So perhaps we can learn from that, but perhaps we can learn from a whole heap of different industries. The Zoo and Equeria Association have got a very good accreditation system, which seems to be raising the level of animal welfare within that industry. So I'm sorry, there's no easy answer to that.
I've actually got a follow-up question, more my question. Do you think racehorses, or horses maybe more generally, fall in an interesting place because they're not considered to be livestock and they're not considered to be pets? So what are they?
Yeah, they're racehorses. Horses, in a lot of respects, are companion animals. I think they, like many companion animals, they suffer from obesity in later life. And so the thing with obesity in cats and dogs and horses is we have to start treating them like people, or look at the people that are with them and start treating the people. And I think that's probably something that we'll have to work on in future, that for a lot of the companion animals like horses, and that's what I'm calling them in this instance, particularly when you get into the aftercare type stuff, that I think we're going to have to think about them in a different way. You can't just tell a person to put an animal on a diet if it's obese, etc. You have to look at that person's lifestyle as well. And I think that's where we're going, that we have to think about the relationship between the animals and people.
Okay, that's interesting, isn't it? And they talk about this kind of revolution in how animals are perceived and the way various industries are coming under attack. Question for Dr. Chris Riggs. When you're talking about the dangers of one last start and bones breaking, with all the science that you've got and all the knowledge that you have, do you think it's ever going to be possible to prevent breakdowns happening on the track in the future completely?
I think it's a good question. That obviously has to be the ultimate aim. It would probably be very difficult to achieve that aim because accidents will happen. What we really need to do is minimize the risk of these repetitive stress injury type fractures. We're learning through epidemiological studies to identify horses that might be at greater risk, and then improved imaging techniques, in particular the development of MRI and CT that can be used safely and routinely in a horse that's just standing and maybe lightly sedated. And with these much more specific or much more sensitive imaging techniques, you can identify fine features which correlate with that little crack I showed in the engineering component. And if you can identify those and stop the horse going out racing, then the outcome is excellent. There's a lot of stress fractures, the outcome, 90% chance of the horse returning and racing again if it's any younger horse. Obviously, we're talking about older horses due to retire, but if you identify that and stop the fracture occurring, the outlook is excellent. There's a lot of work we need to do, and I really appreciate it that it's fair enough for me to say, it's all very well for me to say, make the points I've made, but the question is, how do we stop? When do we know when to stop? How do we know how to limit the risk of this repetitive stress injuries developing? And a lot of research is ongoing looking into that and still needs to be done. But I think over the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to see some quite exciting developments in that field.
Thank you. We were talking earlier about how it's important to highlight all the good stories and all the positive ways in which horses have been used after racing. But Tom, with your journalistic background, how do we counter the fact that the stories about racing that grab the headlines are the bad ones, that they're not the good ones?
Yeah, look, I think it's sort of inevitable that journalists are drawn towards stories which have an impact. When you're a journalist and you're looking, if you've got a big story that you're sort of cooking up, things that show you how important your story has been will be the sort of the outrage it provokes. Nowadays, the reaction on social media. Has someone had to call an inquiry on the back of it? Has someone lost their job as a result of it? Has the government had to change the legislation? And I'm sure the journalist who did the piece for 7:30, she's won a number of journalism awards for actually the previous 2 stories, and I'm sure she had those in mind when she was putting that together. How do we get stories out there, better stories out there? Look, I think you've got to resource people who are capable of working out what is a good story, and what is a story that will genuinely garner interest beyond our sort of close circle of the racing industry, because for a lot of people in the racing industry, we're so passionate about it, we're so engaged and focused in it, that understanding what makes a story outside in the sort of broader community, I think we've got to have people who are well used to picking up those stories and placing them in the right place. So that means resourcing. It means that it's also got to be someone's job. Who is the custodian of racing's brand? And look, in Australia, it's a really interesting question, because we've got different regulators in every state, some of whom don't get on terribly well together and don't work collaboratively very well together. So it's a really interesting challenge. Who is out there on the whole industry's behalf, on the participants' behalf? Who's out there getting good messaging out there, putting really good information, transparent data out there with an honest and authentic voice? So that has to be someone's job. So that would be my tip, really.
And hopefully we can all play our part at the same time. General question to anyone on the panel. I'm not sure everyone's going to be raising their hands at once for this one. What advice would panelists give racing authorities to ensure racing earns and retains its social license? Hands up.
Look, Francesca, I'll have a go, and then I'm sure there might be others who want to chime in. I think the process that we've gone through in the animal welfare debate in Australia over the last decade, starting, as Tom sort of pointed out, with the live export problems, through to the greyhounds, and then through to the focus on the thoroughbred industry, is that society is changing, and we don't operate in a vacuum. And while our industry practices, we're fairly confident and we're proud of what we do and the way we treat our horses. It's very easy for images, and particularly when things do go wrong on a race day, it's there live on the television, and very easy for that to be misrepresented. And it's live in people's lounge room. So understanding that we do operate in a society that is changing. And then secondly is that people make parallels between industries as well. And so if they see, for example, in the livestock industry, that there is end-to-end traceability across supply chains, then they'll wonder why that can't be achieved in the equestrian industry and in the racing industry. And so we need to benchmark ourselves against the other industries, understand what's going on there, and then look to see if we can adopt best practice from those sort of things and then incorporate it across into our own sectors.
I'm going to ask anyone else if they'd like to. There we go. Chris.
I think really following on with from what Mark was saying, we've got to get out there and tell some of the very good stories, and let people know the good things that are happening. But we've got to do it in a truthful and honest and convincing way. And for me, certainly, thoroughbred racing brings these beautiful creatures into many, many people's lives. It has many, many very healthy, very positive things to it. It creates a lot of very good jobs, a lot of very good employment. And it can also be very, very beneficial to the economy. In Hong Kong, it's particularly important for supporting society and does many very good things. But then it's equally fair enough to say, well, we recognise there are some problems. We don't hide from those, we don't shirk from those, but we really want to address them. We want to, as in my area of operation, we know that fractures, we know that these orthopaedic injuries happen. We want to get better. We want to stop them from happening, and we're going to commit to doing that. And I just think a very sincere, honest approach like that will help, but it then needs the journalists among us to as Tom was saying, put that out and do it in a convincing, positive way that gathers attention.
Mark, you mentioned in your, sorry Tom, I'll come to you, in your presentation about the use of the whip. Do you think that's something that is very relevant going forward in terms of social license?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's one of those things you're probably lost on because you're reacting to it all the time, and there are groups that are just pushing and pushing it, and the people who make decisions probably react to the noise as much as anything else. If I can add an extra point, and it's sort of following on from Chris's as well, but it's relevant to your question, Francesca. I think somewhere along the line we have to get across the idea that whatever we do, we have an impact on animals. It doesn't matter who we are or what you do, we all have an impact on animals. And should we expect that all animals die of old age? I don't think we can do. There's an awful lot of poultry in the world that never get anywhere near like a good life or a reasonable age, for instance. And there's a lot of other animals in that thing as well. And I think to really get into this, we've got to start building a connection between ordinary people and the environment again. When we go to the supermarket to shop, for instance, we don't see a cow or a chicken, we just see meat. And somehow we've lost that connection, particularly in the modern Western world, and we need to get that connection back. And somehow if we can get that connection back, maybe then we can accept that some animals have to die before their time.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, if we're as horrified as we are seeing the way horses are treated in an abattoir, but we're okay with it for cattle, potentially. Admittedly, that was a bad example of an abattoir treating livestock badly, but I totally, oh, sorry, my door just slammed. Totally agree with your point. Right, I could continue all day with this Q&A. Tom, did you have one last thing before we bring Di Arbuthnot in?
Oh, right, really quickly, I just want to pick up a point that Chris made, which I thought was really relevant, or two things really. One, I think often there's a mentality among racing regulators, and it's understandable because they're in this under pressure where they think everything's got to be perfect. Like we can't talk about and acknowledge that everything isn't where we would like it to be at the moment. Whereas actually, if we're honest and we say, look, our industry is on a journey, we're improving, this is where we are, this is a goal we want to get to, people will buy into that narrative, you know? Whereas if we try and not talk about it because we're worried about it, that's really a much worse tactic. And secondly, just a really small point, Chris mentioned the jobs, and obviously Hong Kong Jockey Club has this huge economic impact here. But from the research that's been done for the welfare group we've set up, when you talk to focus groups, you know, who are lots of people are really anti the racing industry. When you say this is an industry that employs, you know, 78,000 people in Australia, people's attitudes change very quickly. People are much more willing to say, okay, we might not like it, but you know, you have you do some good. A lot of people are employed, therefore you have some validity, I suppose. So it's just an interesting point, you know, for if people are watching thinking, well, what are the messages get out there? It surprised me how quickly people were willing to look at the industry in a different light, knowing the absolute size and importance of it from an economic perspective.
Thank you, Tom. And that's why these sessions have been so great, and that's why the IFAR conferences, both virtually and in person in the past, have helped to stimulate this kind of conversation and spread the word and help make sure that these horses are looked after as well as possible. So time now to bring in Di Arbuthnot, Chair of IFAR and Chief Executive of ROR. And Di, you came on the first session, you spoke to Nick Luck about where we were at with the work that IFAR does and the importance of retraining racehorses and successes achieved so far. What are your closing thoughts on the back of the 4 sessions?
I'm blown away, actually, particularly with this last session. The speakers have been fantastic, and all the way through the speakers have been brilliant, and the presenters, including you, obviously, Francesca, have been terrific. But it's the progress that's been made in the last 5 years since IFAR started. So from, you know, having a discussion with Dana Cooper about what happens to these horses when they leave our shores. So think to yourself, if Purple Moon hadn't stayed at home and he'd been sold abroad, what would have happened to him wherever he'd landed, you know? So that was part of it. And now we're looking at jurisdictions around the world that are really picking up on this and doing something about it. Look at Japan and France, look at other countries that are just starting to say, actually, we need to do something. And of course, there's different cultures, different, you know, financial restraints on this to do something, but doing something is better than nothing, and talking about it. You know, we had Dr. Ignacio on and Ireland, who have a different approach in dealing with aftercare than was on the session 3 with the Americans. But Dr. Ignacio was saying, you know, he sent me a lovely email saying it was so lovely to be on. And you have to realize in Argentina, we are so passionate and we love our horses and we treat them as pets. They are our pets, well, which is something obviously we were discussing earlier. But it's just the fact that people are talking about it and doing something. And that's the utopia, that every country has an aftercare program. And Eliot's kit is there to help everybody. And we're there to help anybody that wants to pick up and have a discussion with any of us. And I know next week, Eliot and I are going to have a discussion how we can get out to more countries and help where needed. So, well, it's just progress.
And Di, in your role, how much do you find the racing industry embraces what you're trying to achieve and helps you?
It's been bumpy over the years. I think when we took a very straightforward approach when we started, which was making sure these horses had something to do when their racing lives are over, which wasn't the position we found ourselves in 20 years ago. It has been difficult, but I think it's now being talked about a lot more, certainly with us in the UK, and I look forward with our Horse Welfare Board to progress moving forward. But we're all learning. That's also what IFAR is about, you know, learning from each other, a forum for discussion. What works in some countries might not work with us, but you're going to take something out of it and work on it. So it's been a great journey.
And one last thing, it would appear, maybe anecdotally, but I think the numbers would probably back it up, that it would be predominantly men who hold most of the governing management administrative positions in racing. And there's probably a bit more of a significant female bias when it comes to aftercare. What do we read into that?
Well, I think that's good, isn't it? I say it's good. 85% of our ROR membership are women. Most of the operations we work with are probably, are driven by women. The charities at home, you know, racing welfare, ROR, jockeys are run by women. Why is that? Gosh, I'm going to be stood off by saying, well, it's the empathy factor here, but it is to a degree. And elder trainers I've spoken to a lot lately, and I always say, well, you know, have you got somebody in the yard that's doing this? And they'll say, oh yes, and 9 times out of 10, it's female. So I just think we have to take that as a positive.
I think we do too. Well, thank you so much, Di. I'm very conscious that most of our panelists are the other side of the world and it's very late for them. So thank you again for all being part of it. And I hope we haven't kept you up too late. I've got the school run to go and do. So yeah, one last thing is just to say thank you. Thank you also to Di for the closing thoughts and for putting it all together. I think IFAR is doing brilliant things. I think the conversation is so important. And I think each little step that we can take to looking after these horses and to promoting that message that racing is doing everything that it can for the welfare of the animals is so important. So well done and thank you very much.